So, today we're going to talk about child physical abuse. We're going to talk about a couple of different topics that fall underneath child physical abuse, and so we're going to try and break up today's lecture into a couple of sections. So, first, we're going to talk about just some definitions of child physical abuse, specifically looking at legal definitions of child physical abuse and how those vary depending on the state that you're in. So, let's start there. So, historically, child physical abuse has involved some sort of observable harm as a part of its definition. So what that means is that in order for something to be identified and considered as child abuse, there has to be some sort of physical observable harm that has been caused in the child. So something like a bruise or a broken bone or some sort of visible injury that you can look at the child and see in order to qualify as physical abuse. Now, that might seem clear-cut, and it might seem to make this definition a little bit easier to understand than other things that we've talked about in this class, like psychological abuse, which is often a lot harder to define. However, there are still issues with that definition of observable harm. Sometimes perpetrators will abuse children in ways specifically to avoid causing observable harm. And so they sort of skirt around that definition by not leaving marks, or by not leaving injuries that will last more than 48 hours. So in order to sort of combat that, the definition of child physical abuse has changed over time. So certainly there's still that harm component to the definition. And so the way that harm is defined currently is as follows. Harm is defined as an observable injury that lasts for at least 48 hours. But in addition to just thinking about harm, most child abuse definitions also include a piece about endangerment. And so what endangerment means is that there's substantial risk for physical injury. So not only could physical injury actually occur, but also if the child is put in a situation where there's a high risk for physical injury, that would also qualify as child physical abuse. So that's sort of the legal way that they've expanded this definition and tried to include things that may not quite be observable physical harm. Certainly, that's still not a perfect definition, and there may be other ways that we can improve upon this definition in the future, but that's legally what most states consider to be child physical abuse. So let's talk for a few minutes about some signs of child physical abuse. What are some things that we might notice that could potentially indicate that a child has experienced physical abuse? So some of these are going to be pretty obvious. Things like bruises, black eyes, lacerations, welts, open wounds, puncture marks, untreated injuries. So in that sense, perhaps the child's had a history of broken bones that have gone untreated. That might indicate child physical abuse. And then other things like bone or skull fractures, sprains, dislocations, internal injuries such as internal bleeding. Any of these sort of physical injuries are going to be signs of child physical abuse, but there are also some signs that might not be as obvious. And so one of those signs has to do with a sudden change in the child's behavior. Maybe at school, their grades have dropped. Maybe they're starting to act out, or maybe they're starting to show signs of depression or anxiety. So these are some of the things that you would want to look for in addition to those physical signs of abuse. When talking about child physical abuse, this issue of corporal punishment versus physical abuse will often come up. So you might know from other classes that there's sort of a controversy and debate over whether or not corporal punishment is a form of child abuse. So we're not going to debate that issue in this class, but how we're going to approach this issue is from a scientific standpoint. So what does research say about corporal punishment and how it relates to child physical abuse? So let's just first define corporal punishment or give some examples of what we're talking about when we say corporal punishment. We're talking about things like slapping, pushing, and spanking that are typically used as a form of punishment or discipline. So corporal punishment is pretty commonly used. About 75 to 90% of parents report using some form of physical punishment as a means of discipline. So it's not uncommonly used. It's probably more common than not in terms of trying to use it as a discipline method. But what's interesting about that is although it's really common, children are actually the only group that are legally allowed to be hit. So even convicted criminals that are serving prison sentences are safeguarded against the use of corporal punishment. Now, whether or not that's actually carried out in prisons is debatable, but legally, criminals are protected against corporal punishment and children are not. So just to give you a sense of how common corporal punishment is, or some of the laws around corporal punishment, if you take a look at the next slide, I've listed 19 states that still allow corporal punishment legally to occur in schools. So let's talk about what we know about corporal punishment in terms of research. So one of the sort of founding fathers of family violence research, Murray Straus, he actually was one of the first people to conduct a national survey on the prevalence of family violence in the United States. And so he has a long history of doing family violence research and of talking about these issues. And what he recommends is that spanking is actually a way of condoning the use of violence for settling conflict within a family. And so what he's finding in his research is that by using spanking and other forms of corporal punishment, it's sort of sending this implicit message that using violence as a means of punishment is acceptable. And he thinks that it may lead to acceptable use of violence in other scenarios. So we know from a behavioral standpoint that punishment may not be the most effective form of discipline. So if you go back to your learning principles of reward and punishment or physical or corporal punishment would be considered a punisher, whereas verbal praise and some other sort of strategies would be considered a reinforcer. And so when researchers compare the effectiveness of reinforcement and punishment, what they find is that reinforcers are more effective at getting kids to perform desired behaviors and getting them to not perform undesired behaviors like talking back and other things that parents don't like. Whereas punishers are actually less effective at getting kids to do the behaviors that you want them to do and getting them not to do the behaviors that you don't want them to do. So just from a research perspective, there's some evidence to suggest that corporal punishment may not be the most effective method of discipline. In addition to thinking about corporal punishment from a behaviorist perspective, we also have some correlational data looking at things that corporal punishment is associated with. And keep in mind that when we're talking about correlational data, we're not saying that corporal punishment causes these things, we're just saying that it's associated with these things. So we can't draw a cause and effect relationship, but it is more likely to be associated with these things. So some of the things that corporal punishment has been associated with, lower IQ is one of the things that corporal punishment has been associated with. So what researchers are finding is that in individuals that have experienced repeated or significant corporal punishment, the amount of gray matter in their brains is actually less than individuals that haven't been exposed to persistent corporal punishment. And that lower volume of gray matter is sort of what affects a person's IQ. So ultimately, individuals that have experienced repeated or high amounts of corporal punishment tend to have lower IQs. Again, that's not a cause and effect, but it is an interesting association. Research also suggests that spanking in particular is correlated with other forms of family violence. So children that have been punished via spanking were 3 times more likely to assault their sibling during the preceding year. Spanking is also correlated with crime outside of the home, including things like delinquency, arrest, and homicide. And then finally, spanking is also linked with things like cheating, telling lies, and school disobedience. So again, it's important to keep in mind that spanking doesn't cause these things to happen, but it is potentially is part of the picture or the puzzle when thinking about the things that it's associated with. So let's talk for a minute about how common child physical abuse is in the United States and what do the incidence rates look like. So what are the amount of new cases of child physical abuse that we see in the United States each year? So in looking at incidence rates, or the amount of new cases of child abuse, starting back in the 80s, we saw about 300,000 cases of child physical abuse. So that would be new cases of child physical abuse. In 1996, we saw that number almost double. So in 10 years, we saw double the amount of child physical abuse cases. And then in 2006, we saw that number drop back down to around 300,000. So in looking at the incidence rates, we've seen sort of this pattern of an increase and then a decrease. But researchers have questioned whether or not that is a true reduction of child maltreatment, or whether there might be some other factors that are contributing to that decrease that we're seeing in new cases. So researchers have looked at 3 different explanations to explain why we've seen that reduction in new cases of child physical abuse. So one of the things that's happened between 1996 and 2006 is improved economic factors. So something that we're going to talk about in a few minutes is that often child physical abuse occurs in situations where there is some sort of economic depression or low SES. And so when there are more resources to go around, child physical abuse tends to lessen. We've also seen changes in terms of the amount of social workers that are available. So what that could potentially mean is that there are more people out there helping families that are dealing with conflict and dealing with stressful circumstances, so helping to prevent child physical abuse or helping provide education for families that need help with parenting skills. And we've also seen advances in the medications that we prescribe to people with mental health problems. So that specifically means that individuals that are child sexual offenders or child abusers might be benefiting from the advances in medication that we have. So these are some potential reasons why we've seen this reduction. It could also be a matter of awareness. So perhaps we've done a better job of making families and workers more aware of child physical abuse, and so they're going to be more likely to help families in need. So in terms of prevalence, one of the first national studies conducted on family violence, as I previously talked about, was conducted by Murray Strauss and colleagues. This study started to collect data in the late 70s and wasn't published until the early 80s. But what this study did was conduct a national telephone survey asking parents and children to report on the occurrence of different forms of family violence in the home. And these people that were conducting this research, after doing telephone interviews, they would often follow up with in-person interviews to collect more specific information about the violence that had occurred. So this was the first time in the United States history that this sort of national survey was conducted about family violence, and this sort of data was collected on a national level. So what was really interesting about this survey was just sort of the prevalence of different forms of violence that were occurring in the United States. So before this survey, people didn't really talk about family violence within the United States, and we didn't have a good sense of how prevalent this problem was. And what this survey did was it really opened up a discussion about how common family violence is in the United States. So specifically in terms of the frequency or the prevalence of child abuse, what this survey showed was that 75% of parents acknowledged having used at least one violent act in rearing their child, so in disciplining or in raising their child. That's a huge number. 75% of the people that participated in this survey reported using some form of child physical abuse. What this survey did in a lot of senses was really sort of open up people's eyes to just how common this problem is in the United States. So while currently we're probably not seeing rates as high as 75% of parents engaging in physical abuse tactics, it's important to know historically what prevalence rates looked like in the United States. So in addition to physical child abuse, 2% of parents reported that they engaged in at least one severe abusive act, an act that would cause severe injury to the child. So not only are parents just reporting a high amount of violent tactics, but some of them were even reporting on the severe tactics that they used. So this study also provided us with the first measurement tool to look at family violence and the prevalence of family violence. This tool you may have heard of. It's called the Conflict Tactics Scale. It is the most widely used measure of interpersonal violence and family violence still to this day in psychological research. This measure has been adapted and changed over the last 40 years, but it's definitely one of the most researched and validated tools that we have to assess for family violence. So this measurement tool looks at 3 different levels of violence. So it looks at things like minor assault. So we might consider that corporal punishment, those things that we were just talking about. It looks at severe violence, so some of the more serious forms of violence that would cause physical injury. And then it looks at very severe violence, so on the verge of homicide.